Praise the mount I'm fixed upon it, mount of thy redeeming love.
All right, well, Happy New Year's, everyone. Raise your hand if the New Year's dream is just to stay home and go to bed before midnight and lay low. Come on, that's right. Especially if you got kids, right? The worst thing you can do is stay up till midnight, and then the next day is not good. So Happy New Year's. A couple years ago, probably like 1 or 2 years ago, I had to stop listening to my favorite preacher. One of the things I do is, not always, but most times when I go to the gym, I'll put on a podcast and listen to a couple sermons. Obviously, for me, I'm usually preaching, so this is just kind of a way for me to receive. And I have a favorite preacher. I'm not going to say his name on purpose, but I had to stop listening to him, which is a weird thing to say, right? Like, why, favorite preacher, why would you stop listening? And here's why. I found him incredibly funny. Like, you think Edgar doing announcements is a comedy show, which it is. I mean, like every time I see Edgar on our online thing, I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, here's 5 minutes of like free laughter this morning. And but this dude was hilarious. And the thing about it is he was also extremely he had deep biblical insight. And so he would just open your mind, your heart, your imagination to the text, bring out this brilliant insight, and then it was just absolutely hilarious. And again, why, Mark, why would you stop that? Like that's a good thing. I mean, you guys are like, well, who is this guy? I want to go listen to him. And yeah, it was good stuff, but here I had to stop. Because I noticed every time I would listen to a sermon of his, my reaction was like, oh man, that was so insightful. Or how did he get those jokes? Those stories were so creative, and his communication ability to portray them. I mean, this guy is intellectual, he's deep, he's biblical, he's hilarious. Like, man, meaning my reaction wasn't, oh, well, I need to go practice and do what Jesus wants me to do. And so I realized in that moment, man, I've become more in love with the art of a good sermon than I have about the art of practicing the way of Jesus. And so I stopped. Now, that's more of an indictment on me than it is on him, but I felt like that's what I had to do because my life wasn't changing. My actions, my every day of the week and the small mundane things of life, I didn't feel like I was becoming more like Jesus as a result of processing his sermons. Jesus is a brilliant preacher. Actually, Jesus isn't just a brilliant preacher. He is the most brilliant preacher ever. And I think it's safe to say that Jesus' most famous sermon, the most famous sermon that he ever gave, that actually was ever given in human civilization down to this day, is found in Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7. Now, for all you young people out there, I didn't say Matthew 6 to 7, the whole 6-7 thing. You know, oh my gosh, that is all my 7 and 5-year-old do now. So I'm not talking about that, Matthew 5 through 7. And we're very intentionally calling this the best sermon ever because that is what history has treated it as. If it was put in today's language, in some ways, I think this would be kind of like the best TED Talk ever. And Jesus' TED Talk, it's not a TED Talk, but if it was a TED Talk, it wouldn't just have millions of views, it would have billions of views. It would have gone viral. I mean, I think you could say it has gone viral and makes something like the dumb phenomenon of 6-7 look like nothing. And that is that the greatest leaders, the greatest preachers, the greatest poets of society, people like Martin Luther King Jr., to Gandhi, maybe what the Declaration of Independence is to the U.S., or what MLK Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech is, what's the civil rights movement. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is to his followers. This is like his manifesto. And one of the reasons why that is that he covers a whole array of hot topics. So Jesus covers, he starts off, literally, we'll look at this next Sunday, with like #blessed. The Beatitudes, literally, he starts off with the word blessed. He talks about anger, lust, divorce, telling the truth, loving your enemies. He critiques fake, hypocritical religious people. And then he goes deep. And he talks about kind of like the untouchables, supposedly, anxiety, worry, money, judging others. It is a brilliant sermon. It's brilliant. Such that 2,000 years later, we're still talking about it. And it's not even just Christians that are talking about it. Most people in American culture, in the Western world, know the Sermon on the Mount, and they can quote various phrases of it, and they may not even be aware of that it's in the sermon, right? So one of them is like the golden rule, right? Do to others what you would have them do to you. I remember in college distinctly, I was in like an Asian philosophy class, like studying Confucius, Taoism, all that kind of stuff. Literally, we talked about the golden rule from Jesus, Sermon on the Mount, right there in a secular class. And so it's very easy, here's my point, it's very easy to go through this sermon, which we'll be at in the next couple months, just 3 chapters, and your reaction is, oh, wow, this is so good. Jesus, you're so clever. Like the way you called out those religious hypocrites. Oh, that was good. I'm not gonna forget that. Oh, and you're so like creative. In a couple weeks, we're gonna look at him using the analogy of salt and light. You're the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth. Like, oh, wow, those are really good metaphors, Jesus. Oh, and then Jesus, you have the courage to address things like greed, divorce. We all kind of, especially like in today's culture, is kind of in right now, like to have a preacher who like isn't scared of anyone and just goes after the meat of the word. Here's the deal. If that's our reaction to Jesus' most famous sermon, we've missed it. That's not the point of a sermon. The point of a sermon, and honestly, I'd really say any sermon or a good sermon, is to usher you, is to invite you, is to encourage you and challenge you into real life practical transformation. In other words, just to do what the sermon says. That's the point. It's not to, oh, wow, that was so brilliant, or that was so clever, or that was so funny. You're like, yeah, if that's your reaction, you've missed it. So here's what I want to do this morning. I want to do something really, 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 really different. Most people don't do this in a Sermon on the Mount series. I actually want us to start. This morning's just an introduction. I'm going to actually have a start at the end. I want us to see how Jesus concludes his most well-known sermon so that we know how to read it from the beginning. Sometimes it's helpful for me, like once I watch something or I read a book and I know how it ends, I then go back through it. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, like this was going on then. Like, oh yeah, that's what he means then. Any of you, like millennials, remember like The Sixth Sense? Anybody? And like crazy, crazy ending, right? Like you didn't see it coming. And I remember watching, like, oh, okay, I didn't see that one coming. Like now let me go watch that again. Oh yeah, now I see what this is happening. This is what I want us to do with the Sermon on the Mount. Here's how Jesus concludes it. And he actually gives us a cheat sheet. He says, oh, hey, by the way, this is actually why I'm giving this sermon. So I want us to know that ahead of time so that we know how to venture into it properly. So turn with me to Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. I am going to read the first 2 verses of it, and then we're going to go to the end. But Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. If you need a Bible this morning, page 659. And just to kind of literally show you how it starts off, I'm going to read the first 2 verses, and then we'll go over to chapter 7. Matthew 5:1. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. And let's just stop right there. And this is the part that Edgar is referencing, although I never thought that Chino Hills would come up as an analogy for what Israel's like, but bless Edgar's heart. Jesus is very intentionally on a mountainside. Like this isn't just like a random, it is a geographical thing, but he's not being random. And why a mountain? Why is this important? Hang on me for like 1 minute. In the Old Testament, the most well-known teacher to Israel before Jesus was Moses. Moses was a prophet. He was a teacher. Second book of the Bible, book of Exodus. Moses goes up on a mountain. Louis, coming in strong. Is that you got your cowboy gear on? That's right, all blue. Okay. Another rough year though, yeah? It's all right. New year. Anyways, Moses up on Mount Sinai, and he receives from God the law. And really all the law is, it's the ethics, the values, the teachings of God for the people of God, Israel at that time. And so Moses meets with God and receives this stuff on a mountain. This is exactly what Jesus is doing. He's saying, hey, remember Moses, great teacher, great prophet? He's like, actually, I am like the new and the better and the more ultimate Moses. And now because I'm God, I'm gonna give you the real meaning of these teachings. And this is why he's on a mountain. He's mimicking Moses. And then the last thing there culturally that's going on is that you would have rabbis in the first century. And rabbi is just Jewish for teacher. Jesus was a rabbi. He was more than a rabbi, but he was a brilliant rabbi. And a rabbi would sit down, and when he sat down, it was a place of authority. And his disciples then would join around him and listen to his teaching, kind of like a modern day classroom, if you will. So that's what's going on here. We continue on into verse 1, which is why it says this. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. And then boom, sermon starts. Next week, we're gonna pick up right there and what's called the Beatitudes. Blessed are, blessed are. But now, turn with me to the very end, Matthew chapter 7. 2 pages over, Matthew chapter 7. Here's the last paragraph of the most famous sermon ever. Therefore, and I grew up with like this old school preacher, and he said, whenever you see if therefore in the Bible, you have to ask, what is it there for? This is the point. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. And when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. Let me reread for you and just listen to this. Jesus would have given, obviously, the sermon verbally. They would have heard this. They wouldn't have read it. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The point of Jesus' sermon is really, 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 really simple. It's to take his words and put them into practice. In other words, just to do what he says. In other words, maybe we could put it this way. Jesus is not looking for fans. He's looking for followers. Not fans, followers. Jesus isn't concerned about spectators. He's focused on players, and not that type of player. Now, that may seem pretty straightforward to you. Like, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds good. Like I can do that. All right, I'll do what Jesus says. Here's the problem, though. If you're familiar with this sermon, the problem is this. Jesus says some pretty insane things that are really hard to do in this sermon. Let me just mention a couple. Love your enemies. If you live in America in the 21st century, I don't think our political system right now is all that good at that. What about don't worry about money? I think most people struggle with that. That's not easy to practice. Jesus says if you lust after someone in your heart, you've committed adultery. Ouch. Well, that's one that we've actually probably all done. The problem is that we shouldn't have. So let me name a very weird tension with this famous sermon. Everyone says it's good. It's quoted all over the place, even in non-Christian circles. But here's the odd thing. Very few people, much less Christians, actually do what Jesus says to do. And then at the very end of the sermon, he just comes out and says, oh yeah, by the way, the whole point of why I'm preaching this is so that you hear it and now that you go practice it. Because of that, there's kind of there's two different ways to interpret this sermon. Not only for Christians, but actually a lot of scholars do this. It's fascinating. And because of what Jesus says, people are like, well, we have to be able to explain this away because this stuff's too hard to do. Here are two common ways that people explain away the Sermon on the Mount. And even scholars do this. It's really, 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 really interesting. And I want to bring this up now as an introduction because for the next couple months, the temptation is for you to fall into one of these two areas. Oh, I don't really need to do that because of X, Y, and Z. This is what you're going to do. This is what I do. So I want to name them now so that we're aware as we wade through it, excuses that we're going to make. So Darrell Johnson, who's this retired pastor, he wrote this little devotional book on the Beatitudes that we'll look at next week. He comes up with these two phrases, and I think they're genius. So the two interpretations of the Sermon on the Mount that you're going to be tempted to take are these. We'll put these on the screen. You're going to want to see it as frustrating idealism or oppressive legalism. Now, that's all very fancy stuff. So let me break this down for you. Let's take the first one, frustrating idealism. What do we mean by this? This is this. Oh, Jesus, these are great ideals. Man, this stuff's lovely. It's inspiring. These make for great tweets. These are great bumper stickers, but come on, we can't really do these things because they're just ideals. And ideals are, they're just abstract stuff. They're not realistic. We can't really do these things. Jesus, you're just being idealistic. And well, we all know that ideals are great, but you always have like those idea people that you're with and they're full of great ideas, but none of them are practical. Like this is kind of what we charge Jesus with. Oh yeah, so Jesus, these are great ideals, but we're honest, we're actually frustrated by them because they don't seem that practical. This is what I mean by frustrating idealism. So sure, Jesus says these things and they're good. But maybe he's just kind of exaggerating a little bit and we don't need to take him too seriously. Come on. Here's the problem with this view, and it's a common view. And this is kind of like hippie Jesus. He's just, is Jesus, is God in the flesh, so he's saying things that God can do, but we can't really do these things. Well, here's the problem with that view. Jesus very plainly says, whoever hears my words needs to put them into practice. Like that's not tough to interpret. And then actually at the very beginning of the sermon, also in chapter 5, verse 19, he very clearly says this towards the beginning of his sermon. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Very straightforward. Jesus is saying, practice. Writing on this, John Mark Comer in his book, Practicing the Way, that I'll quote from a couple times on this, he writes this: while Jesus does set a high bar, so he does, he's incredibly tuned with the limits of our humanity. Jesus assumes that we will lust and want to get a divorce and call people names and love money and worry about our future. But what's easy to miss is that Jesus also assumes that living his way is going to take practice. Rather than explaining away Jesus' words as frustrating idealism, I think Jesus means what he says. And he says it comes down to practice. Now, the other common way to interpret Jesus' famous words is oppressive legalism. What do I mean by oppressive legalism? This is a very, very, very common view, and it's this: oh, Jesus, he's just being religious, and he's just burdening us with more religious rules to follow that suck all the joy and out of the fun out of life. Man, Jesus and all religion in general, you're just about rules, and what do rules do? The rules restrict us. We're anti-rules. Why are we anti-rules? Because they oppress us. But our culture, we don't like rules. We push back against rules. But I actually want to push back against the pushing back. It's this: every culture has rules and standards. Now, if you don't like rules and standards, you got one option: anarchy. I don't know many people who are willing to raise a family in anarchy. If you don't know, it's been tried, it doesn't work. So it is impossible to live without some type of moral ethic. It's just, you have to. Which means the question is this: which set of moral ethics and values and guidelines will you live by? In other words, what rules, I wouldn't boil down what Jesus says here to rules, but if you want to call it that, that's fine. What rules are actually life-giving and flourishing and bring meaning and purpose? That is the ultimate question that any society should ask. And what if Jesus' way of life and rules are actually after your joy? What if Jesus' rules actually bring your life meaning and purpose and freedom? Actually, what if he's flipping things upside right, and it is actually the things of this world, anxiety and lust and divorces and greed, all the things of this world, what if it's actually those that enslave you and restrict you? And so practicing, not doing things perfectly, but practicing the way of Jesus is actually what brings true life. I think that is a far more healthy, wise, and mature way to understand things. So, if Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, if it's not this frustrating idealism or this oppressive legalism where he's just giving us rules to do, well, then what the heck is it? If it's not those two things, what is it, Mark? For that, let me give you 3 definitions from 3 different pastors, theologians. Honestly, they say the exact same thing. They're just using different analogies, different words and phrases. And I think these are going to be helpful for us as we wade through this sermon for the next couple months. Because he goes through a lot of different topics, and we have to understand, okay, what is the paradigm that Jesus is at here? So the first one comes from a pastor, Rich Viodas. He's in Queens. And quick thing on him, every series I like to offer at least one resource book. A lot of people come up to me or email me, hey, what about this or that, which is great. I highly recommend his book, which is back there for purchase. It just came out last year, I think, and it's brilliant. I'm actually gonna reference it a lot these next couple months. So he just goes through the Sermon on the Mount, beautifully written. And I find this quote of his very helpful. He writes this: how you approach this sermon changes everything. If you see it as an instructional manual for salvation, every time you fail to live up to Jesus' words, you will question whether God is for you. Very, very important. Don't miss this. The sermon is not how we achieve salvation, it's how we demonstrate it. Those who have been truly transformed by Jesus resist the cultural norms around them. Thus, this sermon is a litmus test to help us assess whether we are following Jesus or someone else. In this way, the sermon is invitation and inventory. Second quote, this one from Darrell Johnson, brilliant pastor. He writes this. And notice their analogies that they're making here. I think these are helpful. Jesus is painting a portrait of people in whom he and his gospel are taking hold. Another analogy, Jesus is giving a profile of people who are making a U-turn and welcoming him in his kingdom. Third metaphor, he's drawing a sketch of those in whom God's new world is emerging, those upon whom the light of grace is dawning. Jesus is describing people in sync with that great fact. And then last but not least, it's a very well-known theologian of the 20th century, Stanley Hauerwas. The sermon, therefore, is not a list of requirements, but rather a description of the life of a people gathered by and around Jesus. Let me just summarize all of that into one sentence. What is the Sermon on the Mount? What is Jesus' most famous sermon about? It is about you being a demonstration, a portrait, a sketch, a description of practicing his way of life. It's living in sync with the reign of God. You know, think of like those little kids always mess with like the Etch-a-Sketch thing. It's like if someone was like, you know, what is Jesus like? Or what is it like to follow Jesus? And then they just sketched your life. He who hears my words and practices them. So as we begin listening to this sermon for the next couple months, and we're gonna be in it for a while, this is the basic fundamental question of this series. It's this. Is your life you? Not what you think, but what you do. Are you a portrait of Jesus? What's your profile look like? Are you a sketch of Jesus? Does your life demonstrate the way of Jesus? Put otherwise, are you a practicing follower of him? And I use all those words on purpose, because here are the other options in America for being a Christian. You can be a believer of Jesus. Lots of believers of Jesus in America, and they don't love their enemies. You can be a fan of Jesus. A lot of fanboys. It's an option. You can be a fan of Jesus. You can be a Sunday spectator of Jesus. Lots of those too. It's really easy to be a Sunday spectator of Jesus, a fan of Jesus, and a believer of Jesus. And none of them are necessarily wrong. But that is not what Jesus is interested in. He's interested in people who practice by following him. Now, your reaction to this, at least my reaction to this, is kind of like okay. Well, I guess I got to start trying really hard. Like I got to really try hard to be like Jesus. And here's the deal. It's actually the exact opposite of that. It is not about trying hard. To use Comer's words again, becoming like Jesus isn't about trying hard. It's about training hard. Training, not trying. There is a difference. Remember, those who practice, those who train, everyone hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. What if, I always grew up thinking about, whoa, Jesus, Christian, I just need to believe in Jesus. And there is truth in that for sure. You need to believe in Jesus. I'm not saying you don't. But I think maybe an actually more biblically robust way of talking about Christianity is, are you following Jesus by practicing his words? Training versus trying. But Mark, aren't you saying by training that like you can earn God's salvation? No. Remember, Sermon on the Mount, it's not a list of requirements. It's not an instructional manual for salvation. It's about practicing, training in the way of Jesus. Great philosopher Dallas Willard, writing on this, put this: grace is not opposed to effort. It is opposed to earning. Earning is an attitude. Effort is an action. In fact, nothing inspires and enhances effort like the experience of grace. All right, let me give you a real example. Let's talk about training for marathons. Anybody here running a marathon? Raise your hand if you run a marathon in here. Okay, 2. That's crazy. That's exactly what it was in the 9 a.m. Actually, 3. So marathons are crazy. I've never trained or ran a marathon, and nor will I ever. I hate running with a passion. Like there's some famous quote out there. He's some like Christian Olympian from like the 1930s. Like, when I run, I feel the Spirit of God. I'm like, bro. When I run, I feel hatred. But let's talk about marathons and training. So my wife, Rachel, she's not in here. Believe it or not, Rachel's run 9 marathons. So I'm married to someone who's a marathon runner, and like her parents are, they've like done, it's a whole marathon family. It's insane. And so I've actually gotten a real close look at what it literally day to day practically looks like to train for a marathon. So for someone who doesn't run marathons, which is the vast 99% of us in this room, can you just like wake up one day, oh, you know what? I'm gonna decide to run 26.2 miles today. And so here's all I gotta do. Let me just go buy some expensive Nike $200 running shoes, which are gonna make me fly, because that's what they tell me they can do. And super light, get the right clothing materials, the guys with the weird short shorts, and that's a whole other conversation. And all I gotta do is just wake up early in the morning, put the Nikes on, head outside, and start running. And as long as I try hard, I can run a marathon. Does that work? No. If I did that, and this is just a guess, I've never tried, my guess is I could probably maybe do like 5 miles. And then if I got to the 5 mile point, I'm like, okay, well now I have to really try hard. I have to will myself to 26.2 miles. You know what would happen to me, I think? I think you would find me like on the sidewalk, probably around mile 7, just like passed out or something. Like I physically cannot run a marathon. And I would actually say that's true of the vast majority of human beings. But I've watched Rachel do it. And here's what it looks like to train for a marathon. If you know anything about it, your first week of training, you'll either start running 1 mile, or if you're like Rachel and it's just kind of built into your body already, she can start off running like 3, 4, 5 miles the first week. Does that for a week. Next week, adds on 1 more mile. Starts running 6, 7 miles a week. Okay, that was a bad joke. Honestly, I didn't mean to do that. It's like so inbred now in my brain, 6, 7. 5 or 6, thank you, Juliet. Right, but anyway, 7 becomes 8, 8 becomes 9, 10, 15, 20, and then all of a sudden you're at 26 too, because you add 1 mile for every week. Obviously, this takes 6 to 9 months. You almost take a year, if you're smart and you're like strategic with how you train, to learn how to run a marathon. And what happens? Over a long period of time through training, you change. Literally, your body changes physically. You become the type of person for whom Running 26.2 miles is hard, as it will always be hard, but it is no longer impossible. You run a marathon 1 mile at a time. Here's the problem. Very few of us approach our spiritual formation this way, by training and practice. And then we wonder why our faith crumbles. Oh, well, I just need to read my Bible in the morning. Oh, I just need to go up for the altar call. The pastor gave an altar call, and we all know that if you go up for an altar call, then boom, everything's good to go. Oh, I just believe the right things about Jesus. Then boom, spiritual life, I'm good to go, I'm perfect. And I would say, honestly, it's a lot of preachers' fault that we've preached that way and kind of presented following Jesus as kind of this like quick fix. It's actually not the way it works. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who's built his house on the rock. Now, the analogy is not perfect. You can always poke holes in analogies. You give analogies, someone's like, what about, yeah, an analogy is not perfect. That's the whole point of analogy, okay? So let me poke out some holes. Following Jesus is not all self-effort, right? This is why we have to have the Holy Spirit empowering you to become like Jesus as you practice and train. If you want to use the metaphor, I don't know, maybe you can say the Holy Spirit is like the water that you need to drink or whatever, but like it's him that makes you go. But there is an element where you have to learn how to train and practice to depend upon the power and grace of God. And I think that's the part that we actually don't get. God is not opposed to effort. He's opposed to earning. God is not opposed to training. He is opposed to you trying by yourself. So one of the big practical things in the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to get to all of them, it's a really practical series. He has like a huge paragraph on anxiety. And if there's one area in our cultural moment that I think the vast majority of people suffer with, it's anxiety. And like I'm one of them. Take antidepressants for it. So anxiety is a big deal. The amount of like preachers that I hear who give sermons and like, oh, well, you just need to trust God. And yes, that is true. Of course that's true. And this needs to be said. God can and does heal people in moments, right? So like, again, absolutely. And we should pray for that. But what also needs to be said of that is often, and I say this all the time, God works more like a crock pot than he does a microwave. Now, we pray for the microwave moments, but we also know the good meal comes from a crock pot. And so I think this nuance is so important because otherwise it destroys people's faith. So here's a really, really, really helpful quote on anxiety, on the Sermon on the Mount. John Mark Comer writes this. For most of us, being told to live without anxiety is like being told to run a marathon. Amen? We can't do it. Not yet. So how do we live without worry? Well, we have to become the kinds of people who have learned to trust in God so deeply that we are free of fear. And to do that, we must train or retrain our minds and bodies. So yes, we listen to a good sermon on Matthew 6, and we practice Sabbath. We set aside an entire day to practice trusting God, and we spend time in the secret place. By that he means prayer, where we lay all of our fears at God's feet. And we live in community where others encourage us to trust in God. And we practice generosity to free our hearts from empty loves, and et cetera, et cetera. And over a long period of time, our anxiety is gradually replaced by a peace and unshakable trust in God. Training, not trying, practice. When you hear and read the words of Jesus in the greatest sermon ever given, the question is this: will you practice it? It doesn't mean perfect it. You don't practice something that you're perfect at. That's not the point of practice. But your other options are you'll just be a believer of Jesus. Are you just a fan of Jesus? Just a Sunday spectator of Jesus? Because that's exactly what I was like with my favorite preacher. Oh yeah, so good to listen to. Oh yeah, ha 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 ha. Oh, brilliant insight. Oh yeah, that explains that. But what did it do to my life and the way I live every day? Because that's the point. The dark reality of being a human is this. The rain will come down, streams will rise, winds will blow. The light of being a human is this. If you have practiced the way of Jesus, by his grace and by his power, you will make it to the finish line, standing. And he will say, well done, good and faithful servant. I want to invite up the worship team. If you're new here, the first Sunday of each month, we take communion together as a corporate public family act. And, I was really struggling the last 2 days in the sense of like, man, what is communion as I shepherd us into this sermon? Like, what is the connection here? And I realized this. One of the most annoying things in life is someone telling you something that they don't practice themselves. You ever have that? Oh, well, you need to be this, or you should be this. Well, bro, you're not even doing it yourself. Like, it's so annoying. Jesus is not annoying. Jesus practices what he preaches. In fact, Jesus lived the Sermon on the Mount perfectly. Jesus tells us to be salt and light of the world. Jesus was the light of the world. Jesus says that if you practice my way, you will be persecuted for righteousness. Jesus was persecuted for righteousness. Jesus loved his enemies to death, literally. Jesus didn't act like a fake religious hypocrite. Jesus didn't worry when he had every right to worry. But what does he say in the Garden of Gethsemane as he's approaching his death? Father, not my will, but your will be done. Into your hands I entrust my life. See, Jesus practiced the Sermon on the Mount perfectly because he knew that ultimately we couldn't. And our reaction is like to get down and either to quit it or think that it's oppressive or say it's not realistic when he's done it perfectly so that he can forgive you and I. And we keep practicing because he keeps forgiving. His love always outweighs us. His love always chases you down, no matter what you have or haven't done. This is good news. This is why we take communion. This is what the cup and the bread stand for, is what he did for you on the cross, which was a living embodiment of the greatest sermon ever preached, because he practiced what he preached. I want to invite forward our elders, deacons, who they're going to distribute the elements. We have 4 stations. Wherever you are, come up to physically the nearest one. If you're new here, if you're not a Christian, there's no pressure to participate. No one's going to look at you oddly. And this is a way for us to be physically reminded of what fuels us. The Sermon on the Mount is not an instructional manual for earning your salvation. Jesus has earned it for us. It's so that we are a people that show and live that we already are saved. And this is what the profile of Jesus looks like. I invite you to come forward now and receive the elements.